In the heart of West Africa, in a land where the sun blazes down upon red soil and ancient traditions mix with modern struggles, there is a story that needs to be told. This is the story of Burkina Faso, a nation rich in gold but poor in justice, where millions of children go hungry while foreign corporations fill their vaults with precious metals stolen from the earth. This is the story of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a young soldier who rose from the dusty streets of Bondokui to become the youngest head of state in the world. A man who studied rocks and minerals before he learned to lead armies. A man who watched his fellow soldiers die without proper equipment, while politicians handed out suitcases of money to foreign interests. When community aid trucks stopped arriving in remote villages, when children began to starve while gold convoys continued to roll through the night, Traoré began asking questions that powerful men did not want answered. What he discovered would shake the very foundations of international power and expose a conspiracy that stretched from the mines of the Sahel to the boardrooms of London, Paris, and beyond. This is a story of betrayal and redemption, of corruption and courage, of a nation fighting to reclaim its soul from those who would steal it piece by golden piece. Before we begin this incredible story, do not forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you are listening to this story from. The morning sun rose over Djibo like a ball of molten copper, casting long shadows across the refugee camp that had swallowed the town. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood at the edge of the encampment, his red beret catching the first rays of dawn, his young face already weathered by the weight of responsibility he carried. At 34 years old, he was the youngest president in the world, but on this morning, watching skeletal children line up for food that would never come, he felt ancient. The camp had grown from nothing to house over 100,000 displaced souls in less than 2 years. Families who had fled jihadist attacks, farmers who had lost everything to drought and violence, mothers clutching babies whose cries had grown weak from hunger. They had been promised aid. International organizations had pledged millions. The trucks were supposed to arrive yesterday, and the day before, and the day before that. A young woman approached him, her traditional wrap hanging loose on her emaciated frame. She carried a child who could not have been more than 3 years old, though the child's sunken eyes and distended belly spoke of suffering far beyond those brief years. The woman did not beg. She simply looked at Traoré with the silent accusation of a people who had been failed too many times to waste breath on words. Traoré felt something break inside him. He had grown up not far from here, in Bondokui, where his family had scraped together enough to send him to school. He had been the quiet boy, the talented one, the one who had studied geology at the University of Ouagadougou and graduated at the top of his class. He could have had a comfortable life examining rocks and mineral deposits. Instead, he had joined the army, driven by an inexplicable need to serve his country. Now, standing before this mother and her dying child, he understood why fate had brought him here. Not just to lead, but to uncover the truth about why his people were starving in a land that produced 58 tons of gold every year. His aide, Lieutenant Ouedraogo, approached with a satellite phone pressed to his ear. The lieutenant's face was troubled, his usually steady hands trembling slightly. When he finished the call, he lowered the phone slowly, as if dreading the words he had to speak. "The convoy has been diverted again, sir. The aid organization says there were security concerns on the northern route. They say the trucks turned back at Kongusi and are returning to Ouagadougou." Traoré felt his jaw tighten. This was the 3rd time in 2 weeks. Security concerns. The phrase had become a convenient excuse, a bureaucratic shield that protected those who wielded it from scrutiny. But Traoré had spent years fighting terrorists in these very regions. He knew which roads were dangerous and which were not. The route to Djibo was clear. His own soldiers patrolled it daily. "Get me the manifest for that convoy," he ordered, his voice quiet but edged with something dangerous. I want to know exactly what was in those trucks, how much it weighed, and where every single kilogram of supplies ended up." Lieutenant Ouedraogo hesitated. "Sir, the international organizations, they do not answer to us. They report to their headquarters in Geneva, in New York. They will say it is not our jurisdiction to question." Traoré turned to face his aide, and in that moment, the young officer saw something in his commander's eyes that he had only seen once before, on the night of the coup that had brought them to power. It was the look of a man who had decided that the old rules no longer applied. Those trucks were carrying food meant for Burkina Faso children. "This is our soil, our people, our jurisdiction." He paused, watching another family shuffle past, their faces hollow with despair. "And I am done asking permission to protect my own nation." The road to Kongoussi stretched across the savannah like a wound in the red earth, cracked and potholed from years of heavy traffic and neglect. Traoré's convoy moved slowly, the presidential vehicle flanked by 2 military trucks carrying his most trusted soldiers. These were men he had fought beside in the north, men who had watched their brothers die from lack of equipment, while foreign military advisors drove air-conditioned vehicles and drank bottled water imported from Europe. Traoré had removed his formal uniform for this journey, wearing instead the simple camouflage fatigues he had worn as a young captain. The red beret remained, however. It was his symbol, his connection to the common soldier, and a reminder of the man he had been before politics thrust him onto the world stage. They stopped at a small village called Namisiguma, about 60 kilometers from Djibo. The village was not on any international aid map. It was too small, too remote, too insignificant for the organizations that measured suffering in statistics and allocated resources according to formulas designed in distant capitals. But Traoré knew this village. He had passed through it many times during his military campaigns. The village elder, a man named Suleiman, who had lived through the droughts of the 1970s and the political upheavals that followed, greeted Traoré with the traditional respect due to a head of state. But there was something else in the old man's eyes, something that looked almost like fear. They sat under the shade of a massive baobab tree that had stood for perhaps 500 years, its trunk wide enough to shelter a dozen men. Soliman's wife brought water in a clay pot, the traditional hospitality that even the poorest Burkinabe offered to guests. Traoré drank slowly, knowing that this water might represent a significant portion of what the family had. "Father," Traoré began, using the term of respect for elders, "I am told that aid convoys pass through this road regularly. Have you seen them?" Soliman's weathered face tightened almost imperceptibly. He glanced at the soldiers standing at a respectful distance, then back at Traoré. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Many trucks pass, yes, but they do not stop. They never stop in the small villages. They drive fast, especially at night." Traoré leaned forward. "At night? The aid convoys are supposed to travel only during daylight hours, for security." The old man was silent for a long moment. Around them, the village seemed to hold its breath. Children who had been playing nearby had vanished into doorways. Women who had been pounding millet had set down their mortars and stood watching. "These trucks," Soliman finally said, "they do not carry the markings of the aid organizations. They are painted white, yes, but the symbols have been covered, and they travel with escorts, military escorts." "Our military." Soliman shook his head slowly. "Not Burkina Faso. The soldiers speak French, but not our French. And they wear different uniforms. Dark uniforms, with a symbol of a flame." Traoré felt a chill despite the oppressive heat. He knew that symbol. It was the logo of a private military company that operated throughout West Africa, a company with documented ties to intelligence services and mining interests in multiple countries. A company that had been officially expelled from Burkina Faso along with French forces, but which seemed to have a way of reappearing wherever gold and instability coincided. "These trucks," Traoré pressed, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his mind. Where do they go? The elder pointed toward the northeast, toward a region where several gold mines operated under foreign licenses. They go toward Essakane, but they do not take the main road. They turn off near the old colonial checkpoint onto a path that leads through the bush. My grandson, he followed them once on his motorcycle. He said they stopped at a compound near the mine. A compound with high walls and many guards. He said he saw them unloading the trucks. What were they unloading? Suleiman met Traoré's eyes directly for the first time. Not food, Mr. President, gold, bars of gold, shining like pieces of the sun itself. The government complex in Ouagadougou hummed with the controlled chaos of a nation struggling to govern itself. In the weeks following the visit to Namisi-Guima, Traoré had immersed himself in the bureaucratic labyrinth of mining permits, aid contracts, and financial records. He had always been a meticulous man, a trait that had served him well as a geology student and later as a military commander. Now, surrounded by stacks of documents and glowing computer screens, he applied that same precision to unraveling a conspiracy that stretched back years. His private office had been transformed into an investigation headquarters. Maps covered the walls, marked with pins indicating mining operations, aid distribution routes, and the mysterious compound that the elder's grandson had discovered. Lieutenant Ouedraogo and a small team of trusted officers worked alongside civilian analysts who had been quietly recruited from the National University. They worked in shifts, sleeping on cots in an adjacent room, trusting no one outside their small circle. The pattern that emerged was both elegant in its design and devastating in its implications. Aid convoys destined for desperate communities were being systematically diverted to staging points near active gold mines. The manifests showed food, medicine, and supplies that never reached their intended recipients. But the shipping records told a different story. The weight of cargo leaving Burkina Faso exceeded the weight of cargo arriving, sometimes by tens of thousands of kilograms. Someone was using the humanitarian aid system as cover for smuggling gold out of the country. Traoré studied a chart that one of his analysts had prepared, showing the correlation between aid shipment schedules and gold production figures from the foreign-operated mines. The spikes aligned almost perfectly. When aid convoys increased, so did reported gold exports. But the official customs records showed nothing unusual. The gold was being recorded as legitimate production, processed through proper channels, and exported under legal permits. It was invisible theft on a massive scale. The genius of it, muttered Dr. Kabore, a former economics professor who had been one of the first to join Traoré's investigation, is that they are using our own systems against us. They control the aid organizations, logistics, they control the mining companies, records, and until now they have controlled the government officials who were supposed to provide oversight. Traoré looked up from the documents. Who is they? Kabore spread his hands. That is what we are still trying to determine. But the ownership structures of these companies are deliberately opaque. Shell corporations in London, holding companies in Dubai, investment funds registered in the Cayman Islands. Every time we pull one thread, we find it connected to a dozen others. One of the junior analysts, a young woman named Aminata, who had been working tirelessly for 3 days straight, suddenly sat up straighter at her computer terminal. Mr. President, I think I have found something. Traoré crossed the room to look at her screen. It showed a series of financial transactions traced through multiple banks across 3 continents. The trail was complex, designed to obscure its origins, but Aminata had followed it with the tenacity of a hunter tracking wounded prey. This company, she pointed to a name on the screen, Sahel Resource Partners. It is registered in Luxembourg, but its primary shareholders include a French mining conglomerate, a British military consulting firm, and an investment group with ties to former colonial administrators. They do not directly own any mines in Burkina Faso. but they provide logistics and security services to almost every foreign mining operation in the country. And the aid convoys. They have contracts with 3 major international humanitarian organizations to provide ground transportation in conflict zones. The contracts were signed during the previous administration, before the coups. No one has reviewed them since. Traoré felt his pulse quicken. What services do they provide? On paper, they transport supplies from the capital to distribution centers in the regions. They charge premium rates because of the security risks. But look at this. She pulled up another document. Their fuel purchases. For the number of kilometers they claim to travel, they should be buying roughly 15,000 liters per month. They are actually purchasing over 40,000. Lieutenant Ouedraogo whistled softly. That is enough fuel to run convoys 3 times the official routes. They are making trips that are not on any manifest. Traoré stood silent for a moment, processing the implications. His country was being bled dry through a sophisticated network that used charity as a weapon. Children starved while gold flowed out through the same channels that were supposed to bring them life. We need proof, he said finally, not documents that can be denied or explained away. We need to catch them in the act. The night was moonless, the savannah invisible beyond the narrow beams of headlights that cut through the dust. Traoré sat in the back of an unmarked vehicle, dressed in the clothes of a local merchant, his red beret replaced by a simple cloth cap. Beside him, Lieutenant Ouedraogo checked his weapon for the 3rd time in an hour. In the vehicles behind them, 20 of Burkina Faso's most elite soldiers waited in tense silence. They had been planning this operation for 2 weeks, ever since Aminata had identified the schedule of the mysterious convoys. Tonight, according to their intelligence, 3 trucks would travel from a warehouse near Kaya to the compound near Essakane. They would be carrying what the manifests described as emergency medical supplies destined for a clinic in the Sahel region. Traoré intended to discover what they were actually carrying. The team had established a checkpoint on the bush road that the elder had described, hidden among a grove of trees that provided cover from aerial observation. They had no air support, no backup from the main military command. This operation was entirely off the books, known only to those present and a handful of trusted officials in the capital. Just after midnight, a scout's voice crackled through the radio. 3 vehicles approaching from the south, 2 kilometers and closing. Traoré felt his military training take over, the calm focus that had kept him alive through dozens of firefights in the north. He had not led an operation personally since taking office, but this was too important, too sensitive to entrust to anyone else. If the people of Burkina Faso were to believe in their government again, they needed to know that their leader was willing to risk himself for their sake. The trucks appeared as glowing dots on the horizon, their headlights bouncing as they navigated the rough road. As they drew closer, Traoré could make out their shape. Large cargo vehicles with canvas-covered beds, exactly like the ones used by legitimate aid convoys. 2 smaller vehicles led the way, pickup trucks mounted with what appeared to be heavy machine guns. Security escorts, Ouedraogo murmured. Professional, those are not local militia. When the convoy was within range, Traoré gave the signal. 2 of his soldiers stepped into the road with flashlights, wearing the uniforms of national police. The lead pickup braked hard, its driver clearly surprised. Before they could react, soldiers emerged from the trees on both sides, weapons trained on the vehicles. What happened next would be debated for years to come. Some would call it a necessary confrontation, others an abuse of presidential power. But in the moment, Traoré thought only of the starving children in Djibo, of the mother who had looked at him with eyes that demanded justice. The security guards in the pickup trucks were professionals, as Ouedraogo had noted. They recognized a superior force when they saw one and surrendered without resistance. Their weapons were foreign-made. Their identification documents listed them as employees of Sahel Resource Partners. They refused to speak, their silence as damning as any confession. Traoré walked to the first cargo truck and ordered the driver out. The man was Burkina, his face pale with fear. When Traoré asked him what he was carrying, the driver simply shook his head and said, "I cannot say. They will kill my family." With a nod, Traoré directed his soldiers to open the truck. What they found would change everything. The cargo bed was divided into two sections. The front half contained boxes of medical supplies, exactly as the manifest described. But the rear half, hidden behind a false wall, held something else entirely. Crate after crate of gold bars, each stamped with the logo of a Canadian mining company that operated in the region. The bars gleamed in the flashlight beams, beautiful and terrible, the crystallized suffering of a nation. The interrogation rooms beneath the military headquarters in Ouagadougou had not been designed for comfort. Bare concrete walls absorbed sound and hope equally. The fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows that seemed to emphasize the gravity of the situation. Over the following days, a parade of figures passed through these rooms, from the terrified truck drivers to the arrogant security contractors who eventually realized that their employers could not protect them here. The story that emerged was more complex than even Traoré had imagined. It was not simply a matter of corporate greed, though greed was certainly part of it. What they had uncovered was a deliberate policy, implemented over years, to extract maximum value from Burkina Faso while maintaining a facade of development and humanitarian assistance. Jean-Marc Dubois, a former French intelligence officer who had been coordinating logistics for Sahel Resource Partners, was the first to break. He had been promised asylum in France, but when that promise failed to materialize, his loyalty to distant masters evaporated like morning dew. "Oh, you have to understand," Dubois explained, his voice weary after hours of questioning. "This operation began long before your time, long before the coup. It was established during the era of cooperation, when your government welcomed foreign investment and military assistance without asking too many questions." Traoré sat across from him, still wearing the simple fatigues that had become his signature. "What exactly was the operation?" "We call it Value Extraction Protocol. Every foreign mining operation in your country produces more gold than it officially reports. Sometimes twice as much, sometimes more. This excess production is smuggled out through various channels. The aid convoys are just one method, though perhaps the most elegant. The international community never questions humanitarian shipments. The customs officials look the other way because they have been paid to look the other way. And the gold ends up in refineries in Dubai, in Switzerland, in India, where it is melted down and loses any trace of its origin. And the aid that never reaches our people." Dubois shrugged, a gesture that enraged Traoré more than any confession could. "Collateral damage. The organizations are compensated for their lost supplies through insurance claims. Everyone gets paid except the people who were supposed to receive the aid, but who cares about them? They have no voice, no power, no way to challenge the system." Traoré stood abruptly, turning away so that Dubois could not see the fury on his face. He thought of the child he had seen in Djibo, of all the children whose suffering had been invisible to the comfortable administrators who processed the paperwork of this monstrous scheme. "Names," he said quietly. "I want every name, every government official who was paid to ignore this, every foreign executive who approved it, every account where the money was deposited." And so, over days that blurred into weeks, the web began to unravel. Former ministers who had fled the country after the coup were discovered to hold secret accounts in European banks. Foreign diplomats had intervened repeatedly to block investigations into mining irregularities. International organizations had suppressed reports from field workers who noticed discrepancies between what was shipped and what was delivered. The corruption was so pervasive, so deeply embedded in the systems that were supposed to protect Burkina Faso, that Traoré began to wonder if any institution could be trusted. He spent long nights alone in his office, reading reports that detailed decades of systematic exploitation, wondering how a nation could rebuild when its very foundations had been poisoned. But even as the darkness of these revelations pressed down upon him, Traoré found sources of light. Young officers who had joined the military out of genuine patriotism, journalists who had suspected the truth but lacked the protection to investigate. Villagers like the elder Soliman who had watched and remembered, waiting for someone with the courage to listen. News of the president's personal investigation could not be contained forever. Within days of the convoy seizure, rumors began to spread through the capital and beyond. Some celebrated, seeing in Traoré's actions the fulfillment of his promises to reclaim Burkina Faso's resources for its people. Others were afraid, understanding that powerful forces had been threatened and would surely respond. The response came sooner than anyone expected. 3 weeks after the convoy seizure, as Traoré was preparing to address the nation with his findings, his intelligence chief rushed into his office with news that made his blood run cold. A column of unmarked vehicles had crossed the border from a neighboring country, carrying what appeared to be several hundred armed men. Their destination was unclear, but their route would bring them within striking distance of Ouagadougou within 48 hours. At the same time, diplomatic pressure intensified dramatically. The French ambassador demanded an urgent meeting, during which he warned of severe consequences if Traoré pursued his investigation. Trade negotiations with European partners were suspended. International credit agencies began reviewing Burkina Faso's debt ratings. The message was unmistakable: stop asking questions or face the destruction of your economy. But it was the domestic threats that troubled Traoré most. Anonymous calls to officials who had supported his investigation. Suspicious accidents befalling journalists who had begun reporting on the story. A bomb discovered beneath the car of Dr. Traoré, diffused only by luck and the vigilance of a security guard. Traoré called an emergency meeting of his most trusted advisors. They gathered in a secure room beneath the presidential compound, their faces grave in the dim light. "They are trying to destabilize us," Lieutenant Ouedraogo reported, spreading maps across the table. "The armed column is just one element. We have intelligence suggesting that several military units have been approached with offers of money to support a coup against you. Some of our own officers may have been compromised. How many? We do not know. That is the problem. The plotters have been careful." Dr. Traoré, his hands still trembling from his near-death experience, spoke next. "The financial pressure is coordinated. I have been in contact with colleagues at central banks across West Africa. They are all receiving warnings about Burkina Faso. Someone is trying to cut us off from the international financial system." Traoré listened in silence, absorbing the magnitude of what they faced. He had always known that challenging the established order would provoke resistance, but the speed and scale of the response revealed something important. They were afraid. The forces that had been exploiting his country for decades were genuinely afraid of what he might expose. "We cannot fight on all fronts simultaneously," he said finally. "We need allies, real allies, not fair-weather friends who will abandon us at the first sign of pressure." The room fell silent. They all knew what he meant. In recent months, Burkina Faso had been building relationships with nations outside the traditional Western sphere of influence. Russia had shown interest in partnership. Turkey had offered military assistance. Most significantly, Mali and Niger, neighboring countries that had undergone similar political transformations, had proposed an alliance of Sahelian nations determined to chart their own course. "And if we formalize these partnerships," Ouedraogo said carefully, "there will be no going back. The West will consider us hostile. The economic pressure will intensify." Traoré nodded slowly. "Then we must prepare our people for sacrifice. Because I will not stop. I will not pretend that the theft I have uncovered did not happen. I will not condemn another generation of Burkinabe children to starvation while foreigners grow rich on our gold. He stood, and in his eyes, those who knew him saw the steel that had carried him through years of warfare and political turmoil. Tomorrow, I address the nation. Tonight, I want every loyal unit on alert. Whatever comes, we face it together. If you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to the channel so we can continue bringing you more content like this. The television studio in Ouagadougou had been built with French aid money in the 1980s, its equipment upgraded periodically to maintain the illusion of modernity, while much of the country struggled without basic infrastructure. Tonight, it would serve a purpose that its builders had never imagined. Tonight, Traoré would tell his people the truth. The broadcast was scheduled for 8 in the evening, when families would be gathered after dinner, when workers would have returned from the fields and shops, when the nation would be watching. In the hours before, security forces quietly took up positions around strategic locations throughout the capital. Military units that had been confirmed loyal were mobilized to key checkpoints. For all anyone knew, this could be Traoré's last act as president. He had written the speech himself, rejecting the polished phrases offered by his communications staff. This moment demanded honesty, not eloquence. The people of Burkina Faso had been lied to for too long by leaders whose words were crafted to conceal rather than reveal. At precisely 8 o'clock, the familiar presidential seal appeared on screens across the nation. Then Traoré's face, serious and determined, looked directly into the camera and began to speak. "My brothers and sisters," he said, his voice carrying the weight of everything he had learned. "Tonight I must tell you a difficult truth. For years, perhaps decades, our nation has been the victim of a vast and carefully organized theft. The gold beneath our soil, which should have built schools and hospitals and roads, has been systematically stolen by foreign corporations with the complicity of corrupt officials who were supposed to protect us." He paused, allowing the words to settle. In homes across Burkina Faso, families leaned closer to their screens, sensing that something momentous was happening. "I have proof of what I am telling you. Documents, testimony, physical evidence that demonstrates how aid intended for our starving children has been diverted to cover the smuggling of our gold out of the country. Companies that claimed to be helping us were actually helping themselves. Governments that spoke of partnership and development were actually ensuring that we remained poor and dependent." Traoré held up a sheet of paper, a simple gesture that somehow conveyed volumes about what it represented. "This is a list of accounts in foreign banks, accounts held by former officials of our government, accounts that contain millions of dollars stolen from our people. I am publishing this list tonight. The world will see what I see. Our people will know who betrayed them." The broadcast continued for nearly an hour. Traoré explained the mechanics of the smuggling operation, showed footage from the convoy seizure, named companies and individuals involved. He spoke of the armed column approaching the country, of the pressure being applied to destroy Burkina Faso's economy, of the coup attempts being planned by those who feared exposure. But he also spoke of hope, of the partnerships being built with nations that respected African sovereignty, of the new mining code that would ensure Burkinabe ownership of Burkinabe resources, of his determination to see justice done, whatever the personal cost. "I cannot promise you that the path ahead will be easy," he concluded. "Those who have profited from our suffering will not surrender their privilege without a fight. But I promise you this. I will not sell our children's future for my own safety. I will not betray the trust you have placed in me. And I will not rest until every grain of gold stolen from this land has been accounted for." The broadcast ended, but its effects rippled outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. In the capital, crowds began to gather spontaneously, waving flags and chanting Traoré's name. In the villages, elders nodded with grim satisfaction, their suspicions finally confirmed. And in distant capitals, powerful men watched with growing concern as a young leader they had dismissed as inconsequential proved to be something far more dangerous. The city of Bamako, capital of Mali, had seen its share of turmoil in recent years. Coups and counter-coups, terrorist attacks and military operations had left their marks on the ancient trading center. But on this day, as delegations arrived from across the Sahel, there was an atmosphere of something that had been rare in West Africa for a long time: genuine hope. Traoré's aircraft touched down at the military airfield just as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that seemed almost symbolic. He was greeted by Colonel Assimi Goïta of Mali and General Abdourahmane Tiani of Niger, two leaders who had followed parallel paths to power and who shared his vision of African sovereignty. The three men had been in constant communication since Traoré's broadcast, coordinating their response to the international pressure that all of them faced. Tonight, they would formalize what had been discussed for months: the alliance of Sahel states, a union that would present a united front against those who sought to exploit their nations. The meeting took place in a restored colonial building that had once served as the headquarters of French West Africa's administration. The irony was not lost on anyone present. Where foreign powers had once plotted to divide and exploit, African leaders now gathered to resist and rebuild. "What you have done," Goïta said to Traoré as they sat around a table spread with maps and documents, "has accelerated everything. The international community can no longer pretend that their presence in our region is benevolent. You have exposed the mechanism of extraction that has kept us poor, despite our wealth." Tiani nodded in agreement. "In Niger, we have begun similar investigations. Uranium, which powers the lights of Paris, has enriched everyone except our own people. The pattern is the same everywhere: different resources, same exploitation." Traoré looked at the maps spread before them, seeing not just geography, but history. The artificial borders drawn by colonial powers, cutting across ethnic groups and natural boundaries. The roads and railways built to extract resources rather than to connect communities. The ports and airports designed to ship wealth out rather than to bring development in. "We must build new systems," he said, "not just political alliances, but economic structures that serve our people, our own banks that cannot be pressured by foreign governments, our own processing facilities that can transform raw materials into finished goods, our own military capabilities that do not depend on foreign advisors with divided loyalties." The conversation continued through the night, ranging from immediate security concerns to long-term development strategies. They discussed the armed column that had been approaching Burkina Faso, now halted at the border by the threat of coordinated military response. They talked about creating a common currency backed by their combined gold reserves. They planned joint infrastructure projects that would link their nations more closely together. As dawn broke over Bamako, the three leaders emerged to face the assembled press and diplomats. The announcement of the alliance of Sahel states sent shockwaves through international capitals. Here was something unprecedented: African nations choosing solidarity over division, sovereignty over dependence, resistance over submission. Traoré spoke last, his words broadcast live across the continent. "This alliance is not against anyone," he said carefully. "We do not seek conflict with nations that have historically been our partners. But we will no longer accept partnerships that benefit only one side. We will no longer allow our resources to be stolen while our children starve. We will no longer be colonies in everything but name." The applause that greeted his words came not just from those present, but from millions watching across Africa and beyond. A new chapter was beginning, written not by outsiders, but by those who had suffered most from the old order. 6 months had passed since the formation of the alliance. In that time, much had changed and much remained the same. The international pressure had not relented. If anything, it had intensified as Western nations scrambled to protect their interests in the region. But the united front of the Sahel states had proven more resilient than their opponents had expected. Traoré returned to Djibo on a morning when the rains had finally come, transforming the parched landscape into a patchwork of green and gold. The refugee camp had shrunk considerably, as improved security allowed many families to return to their villages, but thousands remained, their lives still suspended between the past they had lost and a future that remained uncertain. He came without the usual presidential entourage, accompanied only by Lieutenant Ouedraogo and a small security detail. He wanted to see for himself what had changed and what still needed to be done. More than that, he wanted to remember why all of this mattered. The woman he had seen on his first visit, the one with the starving child, was among those who remained in the camp. But she looked different now. Still thin, still marked by years of hardship, but with something in her eyes that had not been there before. The child was with her, visibly healthier, running and playing with other children in a way that would have been impossible months ago. She recognized Traoré despite his simple clothing and approached without the hesitation that marked encounters with authority figures in this part of the world. "You kept your promise," she said simply. "The aid trucks come now. The food reaches us. My daughter will live." Traoré felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he had not realized he was carrying. In the endless struggles of governance, in the political battles and international crises, it was easy to lose sight of what it all meant at the human level. This woman, this child, they were the reason for everything. "What is her name?" he asked, watching the little girl laugh as she chased another child around a water pump. "Sankara," the woman replied, "after the great captain who tried to free us before. I named her that because I believed that someday another leader would come who would finish what he started." The weight of that name, that expectation, settled on Traoré's shoulders. Thomas Sankara had been assassinated at 37, his revolution cut short by those who preferred the old order. Traoré was now 37 himself, leading a nation through transformations that made powerful enemies. The parallel was not lost on him. He toured the camp, speaking with families, listening to their concerns and hopes. The aid distribution system had been completely reorganized, with local communities now controlling the process rather than distant bureaucracies. The mysterious compound near the mines had been seized and converted into a training center for Burkina Faso mining engineers. The foreign companies that remained were operating under new contracts that guaranteed transparent reporting and significantly higher returns for the nation. But problems remained. The jihadist insurgency continued to threaten security in some regions. The economy was still struggling under international sanctions that had been imposed as punishment for Traoré's defiance. Many young people were leaving the country, seeking opportunities elsewhere because the pace of change at home seemed too slow. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in colors that matched those he had seen over Bamako, Traoré climbed a small hill at the edge of the camp. From here, he could see the road stretching toward the horizon, the road that aid trucks now traveled without diversion, the road that connected this remote place to a nation struggling to be reborn. The assassination attempt came at night, as such things usually do. Traoré was in the presidential residence, reviewing documents by lamplight, when the first explosion shattered the windows of his office. The attackers had bypassed multiple security checkpoints, suggesting inside help from someone close to the center of power. What followed was an hour of chaos and violence that would be reconstructed many times in the months ahead. The Presidential Guard, their loyalty proven through years of shared struggle, fought a desperate defense against superior numbers and firepower. Lieutenant Ouedraogo was wounded twice, but continued fighting until the attackers were driven back. 7 soldiers died, protecting their president. Traoré himself took up arms, as he had done many times before in his military career. In the confusion of the attack, with bullets tearing through the walls of the building that symbolized national authority, there was no room for the formalities of office. He was once again simply a captain fighting for survival. The attackers were eventually repelled, their retreat covered by vehicles that fled into the night. Several were captured, and their interrogation revealed a conspiracy that reached higher than anyone had imagined. Former officials who had fled the country had organized the attack with support from foreign intelligence services, determined to remove Traoré before his example could inspire others. In the aftermath, as dawn revealed the damage to the presidential compound and the city began to absorb the shock of what had happened, Traoré addressed his cabinet and military commanders. "They will try again," he said flatly. "Now, perhaps not tomorrow, perhaps not next month, but they will try again. The interests we threaten are too powerful, the changes we're making too fundamental for them to simply accept defeat." He paused, looking at the faces of men and women who had risked everything to support his vision. Some were wounded, all were exhausted, but none wavered. "I offer each of you the opportunity to step back. What we are doing is dangerous. The personal cost may be higher than any of us imagined. I will not think less of anyone who chooses their own safety and that of their families." No one moved, no one spoke. The silence was answer enough. Traoré nodded slowly. "Then we continue. But we must be smarter, more careful. We cannot win through force alone. We must build something that survives even if any one of us falls. A system of governance, an economic foundation, a social structure that cannot be overthrown by a single bullet or a single bomb." In the weeks that followed, Traoré implemented sweeping reforms designed to institutionalize the changes that had begun. The new mining code was enshrined in constitutional amendments. The alliance of Sahel states was strengthened with binding agreements on mutual defense and economic integration. A new generation of administrators, trained in Burkina Faso institutions rather than foreign capitals, began to take positions throughout the government. The message to the world was clear. Killing Traoré would not undo what had been built. The movement had grown beyond any single leader. The international court session convened in a city far from Africa, in chambers designed to embody the majesty of international law. Representatives from Burkina Faso presented evidence compiled over months of investigation, financial records, testimony from informants, satellite imagery showing the compound where gold had been stockpiled before smuggling. The corporations accused of systematic theft sat behind armies of lawyers, their confidence gradually eroding as the weight of evidence mounted. Traoré did not attend in person. His security advisors had been clear that traveling outside the region posed unacceptable risks, but he watched the proceedings via secure video link, seeing justice unfold in ways that many had thought impossible. The testimony of Jean-Marc Dubois, the former intelligence officer who had broken under interrogation, proved particularly devastating. He described in clinical detail how the value extraction protocol had operated, naming dates and amounts and accounts that could be verified through independent analysis. The corporation's lawyers objected repeatedly, but the evidence was overwhelming. Perhaps most damaging was the testimony of the truck drivers, ordinary Burkina Faso men who had been coerced into participating in the smuggling operation. They spoke of threats against their families, of payments that seemed generous until they understood what they were helping to steal, of the moment when Traoré's soldiers had stopped their convoy and freed them from a nightmare they had thought would never end. The court's preliminary findings, delivered after weeks of deliberation, represented a historic validation of everything Traoré had claimed. Multiple corporations were found to have engaged in systematic fraud and resource theft. Damages were assessed in the billions of dollars. Most significantly, the ruling established precedents that would protect other nations seeking to reclaim control of their resources. In Burkina Faso, the news was greeted with celebrations that lasted for days. For the first time in memory, African voices had been heard in international forums. African evidence had been deemed credible. African grievances had been acknowledged as legitimate. The psychological impact was perhaps even greater than the financial compensation that would eventually flow. Traoré addressed his nation that evening, speaking from the same studio where he had first revealed the conspiracy, his voice reflecting the mixture of satisfaction and determination that characterized his leadership. "Today, justice has been served," he said. "Not complete justice, not final justice, but a beginning. The world has been forced to acknowledge what we have known for generations, that our poverty is not natural, not inevitable, but the result of deliberate policies designed to transfer our wealth to others." He paused, and when he continued, his tone grew more serious. "But we must not rest. The court ruling changes nothing by itself. We must ensure that the compensation reaches our people, that the systems we have built continue to function, that the momentum of change does not slow. Our enemies have not surrendered. They have only lost one battle in a war that will continue for years, perhaps decades." The celebrations continued, but those who listened carefully heard the warning beneath the triumph. The struggle was far from over. The new National Gold Reserve facility stood on a hill overlooking Ouagadougou, its modern architecture a statement of confidence in Burkina Faso's future. Unlike the colonial buildings that still dominated much of the capital, this structure had been designed by Burkinabe architects, built by Burkinabe workers, filled with gold that would remain in Burkinabe hands. Traoré stood at the dedication ceremony, surrounded by officials and citizens who had gathered to witness this symbol of national sovereignty. Behind him, through reinforced windows, row upon row of gold bars gleamed in carefully controlled lighting. Each bar was stamped with the seal of Burkina Faso, mined from Burkinabe soil, processed in Burkinabe facilities, owned entirely by the Burkinabe people. It had been 2 years since that first morning in Djibo, when a mother's silent accusation had set him on this path. Much had changed. The aid trucks now arrived on schedule, their contents reaching those who needed them. The mining companies that remained operated under agreements that guaranteed fair returns to the nation. The alliance of Sahel states had grown stronger, attracting interest from other nations seeking alternatives to traditional dependencies. But much remained to be done. The jihadist insurgency continued, though it had been pushed back from many areas. Poverty remained widespread, the legacy of decades of exploitation that could not be undone in a few years, and the international community, while forced to acknowledge the legitimacy of Burkina Faso's claims, continued to apply pressure in subtler ways. As he stepped to the podium to address the gathering, Traoré thought of all those who had made this moment possible. The soldiers who had died defending him from assassination, the investigators who had risked their lives to uncover the truth, the ordinary citizens who had maintained faith in a vision of transformation, even when that vision seemed impossibly distant. "My brothers and sisters," he began, his voice carrying across the crowd and beyond through broadcasts that reached every corner of the nation. "We gather today to celebrate not an ending, but a beginning. This reserve, this gold that has been returned to its rightful owners, represents what is possible when a people refuse to accept the destiny that others have assigned to them." He looked out at the faces before him, seeing hope and determination and the lingering scars of suffering that no political change could entirely heal. "Our children will inherit a different Burkina Faso than the one we knew. They will grow up knowing that their nation's resources belong to them, that their government serves their interests, that their future is not determined by decisions made in distant capitals." The ceremony continued with speeches and traditional performances, the blending of modern achievement and ancient culture that characterized Traoré's vision for his nation. As the sun set behind the facility, casting long shadows across the gathered crowd, he stepped away from the official events to walk among the ordinary citizens who had come to witness history. He found himself standing next to a young girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, who was watching the proceedings with wide eyes. Her mother stood beside her, a woman whose face seemed familiar, though Traoré could not immediately place it. Then he realized it was the woman from Djibo, the one who had named her daughter Sankara. The child had grown, her cheeks now full and healthy, her eyes bright with the curiosity of youth rather than the dullness of hunger. The woman recognized him at the same moment. She did not bow or show the formal respect that many felt obligated to display before the president. Instead, she simply smiled and said, "She is asking questions now. About the gold, about the history, about what comes next. She wants to understand everything." Traoré knelt down to bring himself to the child's level. "What do you want to be when you grow up, Sankara?" The girl thought for a moment, the seriousness of the question evident in her expression. "I want to be a geologist," she said finally. "I want to find more gold for Burkina Faso. And I want to make sure no one ever steals it again." Traoré felt his eyes grow moist, though he maintained his composure. In this child, named for a revolutionary who had died trying to free his nation, he saw the future that all his struggles had been meant to create. A generation that would grow up knowing their worth, understanding their history, determined to protect what their parents had fought to reclaim. He stood and looked out at the facility, at the gold that represented so much more than monetary value. It was the crystallized labor of countless workers, the inheritance of generations yet unborn, the tangible proof that even the most entrenched injustice could be challenged and overcome. "The story is not over," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "It is only beginning." But as he watched the lights of the facility illuminate the gathering darkness, as he listened to the laughter of children and the conversations of people who had gathered to celebrate hope rather than mourn loss, Traoré allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. They had come so far, and whatever challenges remained, whatever struggles lay ahead, they would face them together, as a nation finally beginning to claim its place in the sun. The golden dawn had come to Burkina Faso, and nothing would ever be quite the same again.